We are now streaming live on Facebook.
Yes, okay. I am going to start the recording and pass this over.
It's always a minor triumph in our lives.
It is indeed.
Yay! Okay. So thank you, Lori. You have come to a bit of this, a lot of that, mixing up genres. And as Lori Sheehan, our events person, said, this is the final night of Mystery Week 2020, part of the NorCal chapter of Mystery Writers of America. My panelists tonight are Maya Bonhoff. Maya, you want to wave?
Hello.
Steve Hawkins-Smith.
Hello.
Hi, Steve. Peggy Lucky.
Hello.
And Nick Mamatas.
Hi.
Hi, Nick. And my name is Lori King, and I'm here not only because I am chapter president of NorCal, but I have actually written a futuristic novel and a PI short story with supernatural elements, which I was remembering to a friend today that it was for a collection that was for one of those George R.R. Martin and Gardner Dozois ones that they asked me to write a short story that mixed private investigators and fantasy. And it was supposed to be called, the name of it was supposed to be called Fantastic Dicks. but they changed it to Down These Strange Streets, that I was so disappointed. So anyway,
available.
I know. I mean, missing a marketing opportunity like that is just, anyway, they said I could use it for a short story if I wanted to someday. And so someday I'll write a short story called Fantastic Dick. So I'm not quite sure what topic it would be on. Anyway, and of course, some people consider my historical Mary Russell Sherlock Holmes series pure fantasy, if not romanced. But more clearly in two ways. And this will be kind of two-track topic for this evening. Sometimes we're writing stories and in a variety of genres that each story fits neatly into a genre. Other times we write stories that cross genres, that mix up elements of 2 or 3 or 18 genres. So we're going to talk about both kinds of genre mixing. But first, what I'd like to do is to introduce each of our panelists and ask them one at a time to address the question, what do you consider yourself to be? What genres are you aware of drawing from your stories? So, first, and we're going alphabetical here. Maya Bonhoff,
Yes,
is a musician and writer, science fiction and mysteries, often with feminist and religious themes. She spends a lot of her time working with writers as well, ghostwriting, inspiring, you name it. She even designs book covers for those of you self out there. She writes Star Wars tie-in novels, stories of magic and mystery, and most recently, The Antiquities Hunter, which is first in a series with PI Gina Miyoko. So, Maya, what do you consider yourself? What genres are you aware of drawing from in your stories?
well, I started out as a science fiction writer, and I've always been aware that no matter what I write, whether it's fantasy or alt history or magical realism, there's a mystery in it somewhere. And I think it's because of all the reading I do, I enjoy reading mysteries and detective fiction the most. So even though I'm writing in these other genres, I'm always like packing them with mysteries. It seems to me that with just about every story, there's some mystery element in it somewhere, some discovery to be made, some aha moment to be had. And I found it really interesting that when I was teamed with Michael Reeves for a while on our Star Wars books, and also we did a paranormal piece called Mr. Twilight, which was kind of a detective story, but in a fantasy setting. And we found it really interesting that in both of those cases, the marketing department had no idea that when they wrote the little blurbs for the back of the book, they shouldn't give away the mystery element in the story. They had no clue that that it was there. So that's kind of my thing is there's a mystery everywhere, and no matter what genre it is that I'm writing, there's a mystery.
Good. Okay. Steve Hawkins-Smith is the author of the Holmes on the Range series, which speculates on what Sherlock Holmes would look like if he'd been born in the days of the Wild West, and romantic comedies with zombies. And that is a 3-genre mashup. So, such as Dawn of the Dreadfuls and the Pride and Prejudice and Zombies books, which adds to Jane Austen elements that Janeites hadn't realized were missing. Steve also writes a great YA series subversively teaching middle grade kids about science. Steve, yourself, what genres do you write in?
Well, I think you tell me if this is a dodge or not, but if you would ask me how to describe myself, I would call myself a genre writer, which is a nice way to give myself a lot of wriggle room. I find that when I am starting out to tell a story, whether that be a short story or a novel, story is what I'm thinking of, and I'm drawn to stories, plots, conflict, the things that are typically what define in heightened form what we think of as genre storytelling, as opposed to, let's say, literary storytelling. And so for me, because I also started off hoping to be a science fiction writer, because that's what I had read primarily as a younger person, and discovered to my dismay that I'm not good at it. So I would not call myself a science fiction writer. I've since written a little science fiction, but I discovered through trial and error that what I wrote well was mysteries, and then some horror, and then some Westerns, and then some romance. And, so I'm such a smorgasbord of a guy. Why limit myself? So, the genres that I haven't written yet are merely the ones that I haven't written yet, and I don't count any of them out.
A very good answer that's a non-answer. Thank you.
I should be a politician.
Yeah. Oh, I wouldn't wish that on you, honey.
Thank you.
Peggy Lucky, who writes as Margaret Lucky, writes stories of love, ghosts, and murder. She does straight PI stories and haunted house mysteries, and also has 2 very good books on writing mysteries and short stories. Peggy is a former president of the NorCal chapter of Mystery Writers of America, and a one-time crisis hotline responder, which I think are different jobs, but not always. And she is a former registered agent of a foreign government. She doesn't write spy fiction though, so.
No.
Peggy, what do you consider yourself? What genres do you feel at home in?
As a genre writer, well, I've at one time I would have said I'm a mystery writer. Back when Mystery Writers of America was formed back in the 1940s, that was an umbrella term that covered a lot of crime fiction. Thrillers were not a separate category then, and they've kind of become one. So that's where my heart is in a lot of ways, is in mysteries. My book, House of Desire, I have 2 books out that feature Jess Randolph, who is an artist who works as a private investigator to support her art habit. And those are fairly straight mysteries, detective stories. But then I have this other series with Claire Scanlon, my reluctant psychic, that began with House of Desire, and the recent one that came out just this summer was House of Desire. The original one was House of Whispers. And that got born from a discussion with an editor who was looking for books for a new line that was a publishing line that she was the editor for, of paranormal romance. So I pitched her this idea and she liked it. And then I thought, oh, paranormal romance. I don't write romance. I don't write paranormal. What am I going to do? Well, I came up with one that I think of as paranormal romantic suspense, because before too long there was a dead body in it. And I'm not sure I know how to write a novel that does not have a dead body in it somewhere. So that's my genre, is novels with dead bodies in them somewhere. I have written a science fiction novella that one of these days will see the light of day, and some horror short stories. So I've dabbled around in a lot of things here and there, but probably what I think of as crime fiction, which is what I think of as the umbrella category for any story that has a crime in it, although some people consider that a separate genre from all the others too. But that's my first love.
Good. So Nick Mamatis is a martial arts champion and winner of the Bram Stoker World Fantasy and Hugo Awards. Nick's stories look like horror, but incorporate strong elements of mystery fiction. H.P. Lovecraft meets Dashiell Hammett. Nick is also a former NorCal, which is really encouraging to me because two of you have survived, and we have a couple of others lurking in the wood, one of whom is in the audience, and I find it really encouraging. Nick also written a reference book called Insults Every Man Should Know, and he's edited an anthology of stories based around cocktails. So Nick, with these various different directions in your I have written this shelf, what genres are you aware of drawing from?
Well, just quickly before nerds yell at me, I've never won the Hugo World Fantasy Awards. I was nominated for, but never won them. So,
Sorry.
and they're
Well,
constantly-
I would give them to you.
Okay. Oh, wonderful. Thanks. I've always wanted them. So it depends on my day. You know, when I am writing a crime story, I'm a crime writer. When I'm writing a fantasy story, I'm a fantasist. When I'm writing an essay, I'm an essayist. And there are different modes and modalities in my brain when I'm doing different things. You know, primarily I'd say I'm a fantasist, like a dark fantasist writing weird fiction in that Lovecraftian mode, or another ghost story, or other. Basically, I'm trying not to say I'm a fantasist without trying to suggest that I'm writing about dwarves and elves with swords. Right, I'm writing a different vein of fantasy. And a few years ago, I started to write crime fiction because fantasy can be easy. You can have a situation and a premise and a setup, and then you say, oh, then something numinous and weird and inexplicable happens, the end. But with crime fiction, whether it's a mystery or a noir, it needs a different kind of rigorous logic. And so I felt that was an interesting challenge, so I started writing crime short stories and using crime plots in kind of horrific or fantastical modes for my novels. And so when I talk about what I am, what I identify things very differently depending on what I'm doing. Because I actually have to change my mind, as in the Michael Pollan How to Change Your Mind book about taking LSD, in order to do one thing other than the other. So it depends on what day it is, and it also depends on where it ends up. I've been surprised to find out that I've written some horror, when a horror magazine or horror anthology took a story that, for me, had no horrific element. And just this afternoon on Twitter, someone was saying, "Oh, you wrote a magical realist story for Vancouver Noir." And I said, I was very, very diplomatic. I said, I don't remember any magical realist bit in there, but thank you for reading the story. And then he realized, oh wait, I meant the opposite of magical realism, where instead of it being magic that was part of everyday life, it was something every day that just seemed magical. I'm like, and I said, and then I just stopped reading back to him. I let that hang there. So people read things as well. So partially genre is created in the mind of the reader as well as the writer.
Okay.
So I take no responsibility for anything I do, essentially.
Okay, well, that's probably just as well. Yeah. Just say thank you and take their check.
Exactly.
So you are all 4 writers who produce stories in specific genres and who mix up different genres, whether it's mystery occult, mystery romance, paranormal PI, travel, time travel, detection, or Sherlock Holmes on horseback. Now, not all the questions that I toss out are going to apply to each of you, but you've all been in this writing business long enough that I'm sure you have an opinion. And so I encourage you all to speak up. So I think what we'll do, instead of tackling the question of defining genre, let's first look at, do genres matter? And why? I mean, to some degree, they are, for the convenience of the bookstore owner, they know where to shelve something. And from that, it sort of seems to have gotten into audience expectations. So if you have something on the horror side, you know you're going to find one thing. And if it's mystery, you'll find another. And publishers like that because it makes their job easier and they don't have to think. But is it also something about the basic structure of the itself? Why does a genre matter? Nick, why don't you start us out on this one?
Well, it is definitely a bookstore contrivance. I'm a bookseller now. I work at the Booksync in Berkeley, and I certainly have people come in every day saying, "Where's your mystery section?" And I have to walk back to the mystery section with them. Or, "Where's your science fiction section?" They know what they want. But often we have surprises. People come to me and say, "Where's your Philip K. Dick novel? I looked under fiction." "Oh, he's science fiction." "He is?" And they're surprised to find out that Philip K. Dick is science fiction, despite it being alternative histories and stories that take place on Mars and stories where alien intelligences show up, because he's been so mainstream by being on TV a lot and being in a lot of movies. And certainly there are books that we look at when we get them on every Tuesday morning and think, where should this go? And it can go in 2-3 places, and we make some decision. And sometimes we change that decision. Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency has gone back and forth between mystery and science fiction over the course of the time I've been there, depending on basically our impulse or our thought about where it might sell. But I think one thing that, in addition to being a bookstore contrivance and audience expectation, there's a tradition of writers. It is very difficult to write a science fiction story today without having read science fiction, because you'd just be writing something that could have been written in the 30s. And same with horror and same with crime fiction. So if you've not read inside the tradition, that is, the canonical writers of this or that genre, you won't be able to write that genre successfully. So there's sort of a generational succession of writers as well that tend to conglomerate around genres, and that's pretty important too. So we're all acting at our influences.
Peggy, do you think that genres matter? And if so, is it just for convenience, or is it the story itself that people are looking for?
Well, I do think that genres matter to an extent. I remember when I was a kid, there were like 6 genres. Maybe there was mystery, there was science fiction, there was fantasy, there was romance, there was horror, and there was Westerns. And everything was kind of in that. And I'm teaching a class now on writing genre fiction through UC Berkeley Extension. And I started making a list of genres that I would seeing mentioned here and there. And the list got to be about 100 long. So obviously there's overlap, there's a lot of fuzzy edges. But at the same time, I do think that for marketing, there is that expectation and that it matters. They want to know where to put the book on the shelf. The readers want to know where to go in the section. Even Amazon has books coded according to or assigned to different sections. So I think that from that standpoint, from selling the book, it's a marketing thing more than it's a storytelling thing. Because once you start to tell the story, you want to tell the story according to the demands of that story. And if that story involves elements of this genre and elements of that genre and elements of a third genre over there, and that's the way the story wants and needs to be told, that's what you do. And at some point, somebody gets to figure out what the main genre is so that they can put it on a shelf in a store somewhere. I once went into a bookstore in Boston that was an all fiction bookstore. And I'm sure it's no longer there. It was on Newbury Street, and I loved this little store, but they did not categorize books at all. They shelved them all alphabetically because they had to have some form of organization and some way to find a book if somebody came in and asked for it. but they didn't separate them by genres. And their theory was, well, you know, if they're looking for Robert Ludlum and happen to see Margaret Lucky right next to them on the shelf, maybe that will attract their attention and they'll pick up something that otherwise they wouldn't notice. And they will buy that. And I sort of liked that idea of not having a category any broader than fiction. It's a good story.
Yeah.
But I do think it matters in the real world of readers and publishers and booksellers.
Yeah. Steve, what do you think? I mean, you write in kids books and adult books, and you know, they sort of have a different genre in kids stuff from adults. But do you think it matters, or is it in itself?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that was said. Those were all really good points. And just to kind of boil down my sort of, you know, seconding what was just said, is that as a reader myself, I appreciate genre because there are times I'm in the mood for a Western. There's times I want to read science fiction. There's times I want to read a fantasy. There's times I want to read literary. There's, you know, I get in a mood. And so it helps to know sort of like, well, who should I be thinking about reading? And then, you know, there can be a lot of variation within that, but I know the direction I want to go. As a writer, it helps because I like to sell what I write and I like people to read what I write. And so therefore, anything, well, I would say anything I can do to make it easier, because there are actually a lot of things I could do to try to make selling my fiction easier. But one easy thing you can do is figure out what kind of story you're telling and what sort of audience might exist for it and who might be the people who would be trying to serve that audience, aka publishers, editors, agents. So it just is it's a nice handy dandy tool. But I also say sort of in terms of like what's the value of genre or what do people expect from genre, I do think that genre oftentimes is seen as sort of the working class of storytelling. It's not the hoity-toity stuff. It's the stuff that's going to tell you a story and it's going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it may or may not have a happy ending. You might go into it depending on the genre expecting a happy ending, but you're going to get elements of story and they're going to be satisfying in that way. And that's across genres. I think that's, and again, there can be weird genre. I love weird genre stuff. But a lot of the time when people come to genre, they have an expectation of a story well told. And I think that's a lovely thing to be able to promise that.
Maya, what do you think?
I think it's almost a chicken and egg kind of situation in some ways. I think there was a time when, for example, fantasy readers and science fiction readers did not cross over very much. When I broke in, I think I had my first novel published in '92. I discovered when I sat down at an autograph session, either people brought my books, which were fantasy, or they brought my short fiction, which was mostly science fiction. And occasionally I would have somebody who might have a couple of the fantasy novels, but they would also have like Inner Zone magazines or something for me to sign where my really bizarre off the wall stuff goes. And I always wondered about that because it seemed like there were these two distinct groups of people. And I think there are these kind of, I talk about, writing in the ghetto, being in the science fiction ghetto or in the mystery ghetto or whatever, because I think there is some piece of almost, I hate to use the word snobbery, but it's kind of like that between fans of different genres. It's like, well, I remember somebody telling me, I don't read fantasy, or I don't read science fiction. And they'd have whatever reasons that they thought it was, frivolous or something. One of my friends who was a romance writer, when my first novel came out, read it and said, oh my goodness, I couldn't believe that fantasy could be so philosophical. And it was just one of those moments of, okay, I think sometimes the expectations that there are these really strong lines of demarcations between the genres are put there by the fact that we have to figure out where to shelve them. And that sometimes can be a bear. I've seen bookstores where some authors, one of my friends, Jennifer Ashley, had a historical novel come out. And after that, they started putting her stuff in general fiction, even her romance stuff, even her Regency mysteries were going over in the general fiction section where, yes, I agree it would be great if we had, this one big bookstore and everything was just by author and, alphabetically. But I remember too going into our local one of our local Barnes and Nobles, because we have so many of them. And Michael Chabon had just come out with a book, and he considered himself to be a fantasy writer. But they put his books over in general fiction. So he arranged for the end caps for his books to be in the fantasy section, so that no matter whether you went to fantasy or you went to general fiction, you would be able to find his books, which I thought was really kind of interesting. It's like him kind of owning his, where he came from.
Related to that is the question of when you're telling a story,
Yeah.
One assumes that you, and this is a question that I would like all of you to address. What is that genre that you're working in, and how do you figure out the rules for it? Because, for example, if you're telling a mystery, you have a certain rhythm to the story. If you are telling a science fiction, it's a very different kind of rhythm. If it's horror, you have gradually the horror is closing in on the people, which doesn't always go with the structure of a detective story. So when Maya, for example, when you are putting a story together, are you aware of the elements in your story that belong in different areas? Or, how do you balance them?
Sometimes I'm very aware of my writing in a genre. Like I said, I have some very odd stories that mostly have gone to Interzone magazine that are falling through the cracks completely. But I usually have an idea of what I'm doing. And I look at it as, I got this idea from a book that I read. It's actually a screenplay writing book by a woman named Donna Cooper. And it's an American Film Institute textbook. I think it's just called How to Write Great Screenplays. And she talks about writing a novel or writing a story as being constructing a roller coaster. So the question that I kind of put to myself when I sit down to write something is, what kind of roller coaster is it? So, are we looking at, a horror novel where you've got the thing ramping up, and then there's going to be this big ploof at the end of it, maybe with some little scares in between. But it's for me, it's become so ingrained. It's like I have a mental model in my head when I start a story. And if I'm writing a science fiction story or a mystery as opposed to a horror short story, it's like the mental image in my head just sort of adapts itself to whatever it is I'm writing. But it really is a model of a roller coaster, that I'm looking at. And I wanted to say too about genre that when I look for books, I'm most often intrigued by what's on the back cover, the description of the book that's on the back cover, which is why I think online bookstores that do that, if you like this, you might like this, and allow you to see this is what the story is about, is kind of a cool thing. I guess the way I shop, but the way I write is just, here's my mental model. Now I'm going to put the major pieces of the story in, and then I'm going to go.
Okay. Nick, when you're putting a story together, are you aware of the demands of the different kinds of genres that you're working in, or you just go for it?
Well, I'm horribly lazy, so I do a lot of work on solicitation. So I'm asked, oh, will you write for this Lovecraft anthology? Will you write for this noir anthology? And so there are certain expectations there, but I also know that I'm being asked because they want a me story, not a story anybody else could do. So of course I've got to perform myself, saying, oh, what would Nick do in this situation? If Nick were writing a story, what kind of story would he write? And because I'm talking about myself to myself, as if I'm somebody else. And I spent a lot of time trying to...
Brand name, huh?
A very minor brand name. But I wrote a novel, still some buzzing. I'm going to move backwards to try to get rid of the buzzing. I recently wrote a novel called Sabbath for Tor Books, and this is a book that Tor essentially gave me the script to fill out. And it's a fantasy novel about a knight who comes from the 11th century to the 21st century to chop off the heads of the personifications of the seven deadly sins. And it definitely qualifies as a fantasy novel, and it definitely qualifies as following the outline they gave me, but it definitely does not fulfill any expectations any reader had whatsoever about what the story should be. Someone described it as Nick had writing a fantasy novel with a gun to his head, being told to write a fantasy novel. And it ended up becoming a Nick novel. So I do tend to go for it inside these strictures, but I take the strictures as a challenge. As how dare you put me in strictures I've signed myself up for. And that's how I generally do things.
Steve, what about you? Are you aware of the requirements of the, I mean, your stuff tends to be a little more separated.
Yeah, I am always, before I start something, I am thinking about where is this going to fit in the big landscape, even if I'm not, let's say, trying to go out of my way to shoehorn it in anywhere. I do just want to have, it's sort of like what Nick was talking about earlier in terms of having an understanding of the history of the genre, so that you can sort of know sort of if genre is a spectrum of different things, sort of where you land, because also genre can be very, very wide. Science fiction, there's a lot of different kinds of science fiction. Mystery, obviously, as was said, there's a million different kinds of mysteries these days, and they can be very different. So when I set out to write my first mystery novel, it was very clear in my head that this was going to be a fair play mystery, which meant I had to take a lot of time. And Nick also mentioned the rigor that one has to approach constructing a certain kind of mystery story. And I wanted it to be one that had clues and red herrings and twists and all that kind of stuff. And I wanted it to have that kind of ending where it all comes together, but you see that all of the information had been presented to you all along, and you could have figured it out. That's not just a mystery story. That's a very specific kind of mystery story, and that was the kind of mystery story I wanted to do. So I had to know that from the beginning. That's not something I think. Either you can just know that from the beginning and plan accordingly, or you can discover it along the way. But if you discover it along the way, I think you're going to throw out months and months of work, and I'm too lazy to do that. I like to know what I'm doing up front.
Yeah. Peggy, what about you?
Well, I generally know what genre I'm starting with, but in the thinking about genre I've been doing lately, I've come to think that there's basically three kinds of genres and how they're defined. And there are the ones that are defined according to expectations about plot, like mystery, like Steve just described. Mysteries very well. Mystery over time has come to be a synonym for detective story. And if you call something else a mystery, people are saying, but it's not a detective story. So there's, that evolution. Obviously, these definitions evolve over time. Thriller is another one that is sort of defined by plot. The reader goes in expecting a certain kind of plot. Horror is another one. Romance, very definitely, because the Romance Writers of America even defined the plot on their website. A romance is one that involves people who are getting together for a romantic relationship to bring love into their world. And the ending has to be an HEA. It even has an acronym for happily ever after. But then there's also genres that are defined by what I think of as the need to create a story world, a set of rules by which this story is taking place. Science fiction is one of them. Fantasy is another. These are worlds that don't necessarily operate according to the rules of the world we live in the here and now today, although sometimes they're very similar and it just stretches it a little bit. But fans of those genres are looking for that kind of world creation. Westerns are another one. You're going to a very specific world in a Western. The Old West, occasionally the New West, but mostly the Old West. Historical fiction is set in, it's going to be in a particular time period, but you could have a historical romance, a historical mystery, historical science fiction, I presume. And so you have, and then the other set of genres that seem to find their way into the bookstore are the ones that are defined by audience, YA, middle grade. There was a fling there for a while of the publishing world for new adult.
Yeah.
That seems to have kind of come and gone, but they were trying that. Women's fiction is another category that you see, chick lit. So there's those kind of three general big boxes of plot, story world, and audience. And you can pick elements from any of those to combine into a story, which is one of the reasons we have all the subplots we have.
Related to that, and it's not something that we really need to talk about much, but I did mention it at the beginning. Some of us are writers of books that are in different genres. And you have, for example, in our membership, you have Katrina McPherson, who writes cozy and historicals, and she also writes some fairly dark suspense, both under her name. On the other hand, you have Eileen Rendall, who has 4 different subgenres or styles that she writes in, and therefore 4 different pseudonyms, or 3 pseudonyms in her own. None of you are, I think, using pseudonyms for your fiction that I know of, but can you tell me, would any of you, if you were starting out now, would you choose a different name for your different? Is that something that you would go for, or would you just fear that audience will find you?
I kind of wish I'd done that because I had a lot of science fiction short stories published in Analog, which is where I broke in. And then when I finally wrote a novel, I wrote it based on a dream that I had, and it turned out to be a high fantasy trilogy with lots of magic and, the whole thing. And I ended up with a group of people who were waiting for me to write a novel in the science fiction genre, which I still haven't really quite done, except for the Star Wars stuff I've done. And then people who knew me as a fantasy writer. And when I had started out in science fiction, and as I commented before, those 2 audiences really did not cross over very much. I even lost a book sale to a publishing house because of that. John Douglas wanted to buy it's actually a science fiction novel that I had written for his book. I think it was Avon at the time he was with. And his marketing manager said, "No, I don't know how to market that. That's a fantasy writer who's trying to break into science fiction." And nothing my agent could say would convince him otherwise. So sometimes you get into trouble with genres just because, there's still a perception of this dichotomy. I don't know how much it is now. I know a lot of people who read both science fiction and fantasy now, but I kind of wish I had published the fantasy novels under a different name.
Yeah, I think there's a fair number of people who play with the idea early, but of course, when we're first published, I mean, none of us really believe that we're actually going to be published twice, do we? I mean, what, you want another book? And so it's a difficult thing to come up with from the beginning, but it is something for any of you in the audience who are thinking of writing in 2 different areas. Sometimes it is a simple thing to just put your first initial instead of your full name, so that Katrina could have been C. McPherson instead of Katrina, and that would mean for these are the dark ones. It's something that has interested me, is the whole question of pseudonyms early on, and so if none of the rest of you have any comments, we can go on.
I have a quick comment, which is,
Yeah,
it depends a little on the reason why you do it. I figure it's hard enough to achieve name recognition with one name
exactly.
without doing it with several.
2 or 3 or 4 times.
But there are valid reasons for doing it. I actually have a couple of ideas for romance novels. I've been hanging around the Romance Writers of America, the local chapter, for a while, for several years, because I learn a lot from them, and they're a very savvy group of people. But there is a romance writer, his name is Margaret Locke, L-O-C-K-E.
Ah.
And even now, when I look for myself on Amazon, I occasionally, Amazon helpfully pops up with, "Did you mean Margaret Locke?" And I'm going, "Well, actually, no, I didn't." And, you know, if I were to pursue writing in that particular genre, I would probably pick a different name just to avoid that confusion. But what that name would be, I have no idea. But I think that
Erotica
there are
writer.
some
There's
good
an
reasons.
erotica writer named Laurie King out there, so I know the problem.
Well, I know an erotica writer who uses a pen name because she's also an Episcopal minister and she doesn't want those two identities to get too smudged.
Yeah.
So, you know, there are good reasons for doing it.
Mm.
If I may jump in and say,
Yeah.
I'm lucky in that there isn't a Steve Hackenschmidt out there or anything even close to my name. So I've kind of got that end of things to myself. So that's nice. I've certainly been aware that there might have been times where a pseudonym would have been something maybe in a business sense wise to think about. I'm a very slow writer, and all of my end products are my preciouses, and my ego is too big to let any of them go out into the world without my name on them. But the way I rationalize this is actually being an okay business decision, is that even though I've written in many different genres, all of my books, I think, feel like me. If you look at the brand of me, Steve Hawkinsmith, when you read one of my books, it feels like one of my books. It doesn't matter which genre it is. You can tell it's me. And so I can feel like that's one thing that's consistent across all these, so that even if you're a fan of a different genre, if you pick up, you know, a book of mine that you might not, you know, be inclined to read because of the genre, if you like my other books, you'll like this one, because I tend to do that kind of thing, which might make me a one-note writer. I don't know. I hope not. But that's one way that I look at that question is, if people are looking for consistency of a certain kind of story that they found from me, they can even go to different genres and still find a sensibility that is consistent across very different kinds of genres.
So maybe the only time when you really should plan on having a pseudonym is if you're going to be writing books that you don't want your mom to read.
That would be the perfect time to do it.
Okay. So there's your writing tip from the panel is you know, choose your genre carefully. So I think that we've sort of covered a question of why we would stick to rules, you know, because it enables people to know what they're going to get with the book. But why do we sometimes break the rules by combining elements? What advantages are there to writing a book? And it isn't always simple, especially if it's not an established mashup, to convince a publisher that this is a possibility, that you can indeed introduce Jane Austen to zombies and get a quite successful story. That you can do like Charlaine Harris. I mean, she's so established now that she sort of is the mashup process. But if she were to start with the Midnight Texas books, kind of Weird West, I guess they call, hard sell when you're the first person out the gate. But that that you have a book that can only be told as a mix-up of genres. How do you approach that? What are your problems and what are the advantages? What kinds of stories do you find really demand told in a couple of different genres or subgenres? Nick, let's start with you.
Well, I think to a certain extent, the rules are always in flux. So I think we can't write a naive science fiction novel or a naive mystery anymore. we have to say, well, because of these other mysteries in the past, I have to write this mystery slightly differently. And so the rules are always changing a little bit and are being changed by people who are impacted by the changes of the rules. So there's always that issue. So there are generational issues, and there are in different genres, scientific issues or issues of fashion that change the rules a lot. And I mean, we see people like, who wrote Chick lit in the 90s. It was so huge, and now Chick lit is hard to publish. Or urban fantasy is now hard to publish, even though it was so huge 10 years ago. They changed the rules, they made all sorts of different things, and then it faded away. So on one level, we can't really be stuck at writing, treating rules like they're sonnets. Oh, we have to have this number of syllables or this kind of layout as a poem. We're always going to be shifting around. But as far as doing it explicitly so, I mean, I think we want to be part of a genre, we want to be found in a bookcase, but we also want to stand out inside that bookcase. If the only thing you have to offer to somebody is that you're a mystery writer, well, there are another 1,000 mystery writers out there. So you have to bring something that is up there yourself to it, which may involve violating some rules or bringing something that goes beyond or outside of the genre to the genre. Otherwise, you are just basically, you're not a genre writer, you're a generic writer. So I just think it's inevitable, and until such point when we have machines doing this instead of us, which would be a bad thing, we're always constantly breaking and making new rules.
Maya, what are your thoughts on that and the kinds of stories that you can now only tell by breaking rules?
I think that I discovered a lot of them because I have wild dreams and I want to write the stories about them. The kind of dreams where they've got credits and a soundtrack and they're in color and that kind of thing. But I think that it's interesting because I think the impulse to do it is to create something, as Nick said, that stands out on the shelf, that it's not like everything. And when you do that, it's a roll of the dice and you're taking a chance. But at the same time, I think it's partly for me, keeping the process young and fresh and bringing elements into a genre that I've read since I was a kid, and try to, doing things to make the story go off in unexpected directions. The problem, of course, is when it hits the publisher's desk and you either catch the lightning in a bottle, like J.K. Rowling did with the Harry Potter series, or you miss the wave. And it just really depends on the how much coffee the editor has had. I remember being in a panel with Patrick Nielsen Hayden and Teresa, which were at Tor at the time, and they were talking about, because somebody asked that question, is how does that happen? How does a new novel come along and you buy it? And he says, it's sort of like you're sitting there and you're just, going, oh, this is like that one and this is like that one, and then it lands in your desk and it's different. And you have this moment of total insanity and you fall in love with that book, whatever it is, and you have to publish it even though you're probably going to lose your job over it and it's crazy. And it becomes this big deal. And then 5,000 more novels just like it, all of the knockoffs come through. And he says, and then sanity reimposes itself and you're back to just sort of counting, the pages is this interesting for a science fiction story or whatever. But there's, that's what you hope for, I think, when I throw a novel out. With Antiquities Hunter, it knocked around for a while because the first time I sent it to Random House and the editor was retiring, but he loved the book. So he handed it to the editor that was going to be taking his place, and he loved the book. And they showed it to a third editor and he loved the book. And the marketing manager said, I don't know how to market this thing because there are these weird little bits of, well, is it magic? Is it not? That kind of, and I had a Japanese American protagonist. And the bad guys were white, and it was one of those things where I wasn't really sure, but I think persistence is the better part of valor in that case. Write what we write what turns us on. Stephen King says, write for yourself, not for anybody else, and then try to find home for it. But it's all from with me, it's just all from, I really want to tell this story and this is the way I want to tell it.
Steve, what do you think?
Well, my thunder was just stolen because that was exactly what I was going to say in terms of writing books are hard. Yeah, thank you very much. Writing a book is hard, and you got to be excited about it. So, the main thing to me is finding an idea that gives you the excitement to slog to the end of 85,000 words or whatever. And myself as a reader, I give myself the credit of being, very non-judgmental about genres. I love them all, some more than others, but I'm very open-minded, very open to them all, so that you throw them into the blender, and that's fine by me. That just makes for a tastier beverage. Now, the problem can be that, you have your tasty beverage and it gets you to the end of 85,000 words, and then you have to send it out into the world where people are going to apply their own yardsticks. And I do remember the first time, I believe it was the first time, or it was very early on from my first novel, Holmes on the Range, combination of Western and mystery, but with absolutely the mystery in the front, Holmes on the Range. And it's, very much something that is like, in fact, I was very reluctant to ever describe it as a Western. I was worried about that, and would much more sort of try to position it as like a historical novel that's set in the Old West. But the one of the earliest rejection letters I got was from some agent or other, and I recall his response was something like, "Well, sir, it seems you have written a Western. I do not represent Westerns." And it's like, did you read any of it? And it was taken from a short story series in Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine. But so we can have what we love, and you'd be excited about that idea. And I do think that is the number one thing. And then we have to be just prepared for the people who are not as broad-minded as I am, and will try to stick you in little holes and dismiss you that way.
Well, Peggy, now I'm going to ask you that same question about breaking the rules, but we're also going to go into a next question which sort of has to do with it, and you can start it with that.
Okay.
That talking about if you've decided to break the rules, and why, how do you keep from creating just a dysfunctional monster? Because as all of you have said, there's certain expectation to have an editor who doesn't recognize that this is a story and not a Western. You have somebody who only reads fantasy, but doesn't, or only reads mysteries, but doesn't know what to do when there's magical elements in it. How do you create a story that isn't dysfunctional and just has bits glued on? Do you yourself outline and make deliberate choices? Do you do a first draft and see what the balance is and what it needs? How do you do that?
Very carefully.
Which is why I asked you.
I don't really think that there are rules per se. There are expectations and there are guidelines and all of that. But when you sit down to write a story, what I have found is that very rarely is the story that I have when I type the end at the end of it, the story I thought I was going to have when I started out. There's been twists and turns and changes, and I get to know characters, and characters sometimes sit there and say, "I'm not doing that. You want me to do that, but I'm not doing that." Maybe nobody else has this experience, but I do have rebellious characters sometimes. When I wrote my first novel, I did it pretty much as a straight mystery according to the expectations of mysteries, with laying out the clues and all of that, in part because I liked the challenge of it. I wanted to see if I could do it. I wanted to see if I could make it work, if I could come up with a story that did fit those parameters and those expectations. And I had fun doing it. But ultimately, I think what you have to do is let the story be what it wants to be. And if that, and I think that's one of the reasons why we have all these subgenres, these 100 subgenres that seem to be out there, is because writers aren't always trying to follow the rules. They're saying, well, this element and that element fits in my story. And but there are certain precepts to a good story. Steve mentioned good storytelling, the beginning and the middle and the end, and having characters develop and change along the way. And, if you take those basics of good storytelling and you apply, your own insights and bring your own heart into it, and occasionally let the characters have their way, I think you're going to end up with something pretty good. The stories that are problematic, the ones that are hard, are the ones where somebody said, oh, well, so-and-so had great success with this kind of story, so I'm going to write one just like that. All of the J.K. Rowling wannabes that were out there, who thought that was the way that to success. And I think the way to write a successful story is to commit yourself to telling a good story, whatever it takes, and to put your own wit and wisdom and heart into it.
Yeah. Maya, what about you? How do you put this story together? Do you outline it deliberately? Play with it once you've got something on the paper and see what's working and what isn't?
I usually, if I'm going to introduce, like if I'm writing magical realism or urban or contemporary fantasy, I do want to think carefully about where I start to introduce the off-kilter elements to the story. So
do they still call it the woo-woo factor?
The woo-woo factor, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. You hear the in the room, and I outline differently for every book that I work on. Sometimes I start with Post-it notes, but I mean, generally I put down the major movements of the piece and then I work my way through. So as I do that, I'm also very carefully thinking about, is this the right moment to bring up the woo-woo factor? Was that weird? And because I love ambiguity and I like to write stories where it's in the eye of the beholder, I sometimes am really careful about, I actually sold a story called The White Dog to Interzone, where when I sent it to him, the editor called me and he said, where's the fantasy in this story? And I said, oh, it's in the eye of the reader. And he said, oh, and he published it. And then it was nominated, it was shortlisted for a British Science Fiction Award, which totally blew my mind. So here's a story that was ambiguously fantasy. So, but for that level of it really does come down to over the years developing an instinct about that movement where something comes in. And sometimes that does happen at the outlining stage. And sometimes it happens as I'm making my way through the book and a little finger pokes me on the shoulder and says, right here, right here, right here, put it here.
More woo-woo.
More woo-woo. Yeah, you need more woo-woo in this thing.
But what about you, Steve? What's your process?
Well, I have been up until now a super meticulous, which is to say super anal outliner. I have outlined not just sort of the overall plot, but I do outlines that are chapter by chapter and beat by beat within the chapter. I basically sort of pre-write the book so that I know everything that happens. And I know a lot of writers have told me they think this would drive them crazy because they'd be so bored when it came time to actually write the thing, right? And they prefer to discover the story as they go along. I have thought up to now that I could not discover the story because I can't write unless I know what I'm saying. I have to know where I'm going. I can't just kind of wander around and put words down and hope that they're going to lead me in the right direction. I just need to know where I'm going. But I have tried an experiment this year, and it does have to do with sort of the different parameters of different genres. That in the past I've written mostly mysteries, and those again I just feel like I don't think I could write the kind of mystery that I would want to write without outlining, without knowing all along who did it, so that I can plan it all accordingly and have it develop accordingly. But I decided as a what the heck thing, because I've dabbled in the Western world, to write a straight Western novel this year. So that's what I've been doing. And I thought, well, this is that there's a different sort of expectation here, and these plots can develop in a different way. Maybe I could write this without an outline. Maybe this is my big chance to free myself. And the first chapter was hell. It was horrible because I thought it was because I didn't know where it was going, but even though it was like it was a scene that in itself had a beginning, a middle, and an end, which should have been enough, it was still really, really hard for me to write and to feel like it was going where I wanted it to go. So I set it aside for a while, and when I returned to it, what I realized was that the reason it was so hard was that I didn't understand who the lead character was. I didn't have his viewpoint at all. And how could I write this guy unless I know who he is? And once I started to zero in on who is this guy, I zeroed in on what an odd fellow he was, especially an odd fellow to be the lead of a Western novel. And once I locked into that, that basically gave me my permission, because I'd been sort of setting out to do sort of like a straight action Western. And what I discovered is maybe I can't write a straight action Western. I have to write it about this weirdo. So, okay. And once I knew who he was and who his compatriots were and what sort of situations these guys would get themselves into, then it flowed, and it's been a ton of fun, and I'm halfway done with the book, and it's been very, very entertaining to me. I do think I'm going to have to stop and now outline the second half of the book, because I don't trust myself to be able to construct a satisfying conclusion without knowing where the heck it's going. But I did allow myself that, because this kind of Western story could be a little more loosey-goosey and have a different kind of momentum than collecting clues, and that leads here, and this leads here, and that leads here.
Welcome to the dark side, Steve.
I like the dark side. The dark side, I'm liking it.
Yeah, we don't know what we're writing, but we have fun. Nick, how do you handle the construction of a story?
Definitely don't outline very much at all. I used to early on, but I discovered that I'd outline and get to the end about 15,000 words too early and have to come up with a second ending. Not a different ending, but I just add a second ending to the first ending. So the first ending would just be Act 2 turning to Act 3. So then I just stop outlining and kind of depend on understanding a character and specifically point of view. Since, when you choose a point of view, whether it's third person, first person, many other decisions are made for you after that. Like the rigorous logic of some point of view tells you what information you can give a reader at one point in the story. And that tends to solve a lot of my problems. And that is something that sort of transgenre, the first person mystery versus the first person horror story, the informational logics are still going to be more or less identical. So once I solve that problem of point of view and which point of view to use and which perspective to use inside that point of view, everything pretty much solves itself until I get to the end. Having said that, one of the big obstacles I face is that the publishing industry at this point wants series about the same characters doing things for 95,000 words. And I write one book about one character doing something for 70,000 words. And so my solution has created another set of problems for me, mostly dealing around my rent.
Well, if I can toss something else in here, Lori, because I didn't talk about actual process, but I've done it just about every way you can. My most recent book refused to be outlined, despite several efforts to try. And so it was strictly put it down on the page and see what happens. And I ended up having to cut 40,000 words out of my first draft in order to have a manageable book. And I tend to think the people who say, oh, I don't outline at all, are thinking of that thing that they used to do in 8th grade with the Roman numeral 1 and the capital letter A and stuff. And when they say outline, and that for a lot of them, the first draft, they do outline, but they call it the first draft. I've also, the book that House of Whispers that I pitched to the editor and it was bought before I wrote it. And then they said, send me a synopsis. And the only way I could come up with a synopsis was to do a scene by scene outline and then reduce it. And I was very surprised at how easy that book was to write, how much fun it was to write, despite the fact that I knew what was going to happen, but filling in all of the blanks around the edges was great fun. And I was also surprised that it didn't change much, because my feeling with an outline is that if the story decides to go in a different direction, you ditch the outline or you change the outline rather than try to force the story. But a couple of my books, and this is the one I think works best for me, is I did sort of a 3-part outline. I would outline Act 1, and then I would kind of get antsy and then write it. And then I would get antsy because I didn't know where I was going. So then I would outline the whole middle section, and then I would write that. And then I would find, well, I don't know where it's going from here. I need to figure out how to get to the end, even if I had a rough idea of the end in mind. How I was going to get from here to there, I often didn't know. And then I would outline that. And that allowed me to take advantage of some serendipitous things that happened during the writing process that I wouldn't have known if I'd outlined it straight through, but seemed to satisfy my need to A, know where I'm going, and B, have the fun of just letting it flow on the page. Every book seems to have its own demands.
Indeed. And the more books you have, the more different ways you've learned how to write. So it is now almost 10 after 8. I have one more question that I'd like to ask the panel, and then we're going to take 2 or 3 of the questions that have showed up at the side. Lori Sheehan is going to feed me those. Lori, can I also ask, what I'm doing here is I am going to ask for recommendations from the people, and to save everyone, madly trying to take notes and get down names and misspelling them. If you would write them down, we'll check them out, and tomorrow we'll put a post on the comment on where this is on Facebook. So any of the recommendations that here tonight will be on the Facebook comments for the video tomorrow. Okay. So Lori, if you'd write those down and save me from scribbling while I'm up and down. Thank you. So what I would like to do for my last question for you good folk is, I'd like a couple of recommendations, either in craft or writers who do the mix well, who produce works that are in a mix of genres. So that, for example, one of my favorite police procedurals is those written by Ben Aronovich, in which his cop stumbles across the reality of magic. But they are definitely police procedurals, just with magic. So that kind of thing. If you on the panel, do you have anything, and if you would rather give a craft book that you really would like people to make use of, that's fine. But something that you think people who are listening to this panel really shouldn't miss. Let's see, Peggy, let's start with you.
Well, I'll mention my friend Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough. And the reason that her name comes to mind in this context is that she's written, she's written more than 100, but has published nearly 100 novels in almost every genre you can think of. She's best known for a historical horror series featuring the Count of Saint-Germain, but she's written mysteries, she's written romance, she's written other more contemporary kinds of horror. She's written science fiction. She's written Westerns. She knows a lot about how genres work. She doesn't necessarily blend a whole lot of them in a single book, but as somebody who is versatile in moving from genre to genre, I think her name is worth bringing up.
Yeah, good. Maya, do you have anyone you'd recommend?
Yeah, I really love the work of Tim Powers. I think that I first realized that I guess they call it urban fantasy now, maybe was a thing when I read his book Earthquake Weather. And it starts out being just like a kind of almost a mystery, and then the ooey factor kind of comes in very gradually until you realize that what's going on is not what you think is going on. And I have just always loved that. It fascinated me, the way the real and the surreal kind of combine in his work. He's a beautiful job.
The craft of being able to do that kind of thing seamlessly is really, I mean, it's the kind of book that you read once and you think, how did he do that?
Yeah. I'd also like to just plug again the craft book, Donna Cooper's writing great screenplays with her roller coaster model. It's like it made the whole thing like, ooh, in my head when I read it.
Even if you're not doing screenplays,
it's wonderful for any kind of storytelling. It really helps visualize so that, because I'm not good at meticulously outlining. I do some, but not. I rebel against it, in fact.
Nick, what about you? Who do you thrust in people's hands?
I would pick Sarah Gran. That's Sarah without an H, Gran.
Right.
And her first novel was a women's fiction with a vaguely metaphysical aspect to it, Saturn's Return to New York. Second novel was a horror novella called Come Closer. Third book was a noir, Dope. And then she wrote 3 mystery novels, the Claire DeWitt series, which are about a subculture of detectives who don't use standard logic detection, but use a different kind of metaphysical detection to solve their crimes. And the final book in the series, Infinite Blacktop, basically the story is the crime novel. I sold a copy of it the other day at work. And so it's the ultimate crime novel, meaning that it just seems impossible to write one now after she's written this. Because it really
Steve,
just
what
sort of
about you?
detonates it in a really bizarre way. And so that's what I've been pushing.
That very good. Well, it's always good to have our own bookseller recommendations. Steve, what about you? What do you thrust in people's hands?
Well, I'm going to throw a lot of writers at the wall here, and I hope none of them get injured in the process. But it's funny, when I first did my first series, the Homes on the Range series, I was not actually a huge Western fan. I liked them okay, but now just sort of like Western mystery or Western sort of mashup-y stuff is really very much my wheelhouse as a reader. I love it. I can't get enough of it. And I have to give shout outs to some of our Northern California writers. We have Ann Parker in our chapter, who writes the Silver Rush series, which is, if you look at these, not so much as like Westerns, but just like really well-researched historical novels about American history that happen to have crime elements. If you're not a Western fan, think of them that way. And I think Ann Parker would be a delightful experience. Or there's Bill Cronzini and Marcia Muller do a series called the Carpenter and Quincannon series, which is very much a mashup of mysteries and Westerns. There's somebody I want to throw out who's very obscure and forgotten, and I feel like I should give him a shout. His name is Douglas C. Jones. And he was a sort of well-regarded, but not particularly popular historical novelist back in the 60s and 70s. I think his most well-known thing was The Trial of George Armstrong Custer, which was sort of a alternate history in which Custer survives the Little Bighorn and is put on trial as court-martialed. I think it was turned into a TV movie in the 70s. But he wrote a series of historical mysteries or Western mysteries that were set in Indian territory with a very quirky lead character. Also with very quirky names, most of the books. The one I remember best is Winding Stair, and it's just a super good, kind of creepy, gothic-y, Western-y book. And the last thing I'll say, because I know I've gone on too long, speaking of that mix of things, which is kind of like my favorite thing, is that there's a classic American novel that is one of my very favorite novels of all time because of many elements, but the voice, oh boy, if you enjoy voice, American voice in a novel, this is the novel for you. And people often describe it as a Western. It is a Western, but it is also a crime novel and in a way a mystery. You could throw it in there, and that's True Grit by Charles Portis. Any writer of genre fiction who has not read True Grit by Charles Portis is really doing themselves a disservice.
Lovely. So we will write those down and put those on Facebook tomorrow. And if you think of any others, do toss them along. Lori Sheehan, if you would like to do your function from behind the curtain or open the curtains and appear and feed us any questions that people have had. I see there's quite a few chats there, but I'm not sure. It's very difficult for me to keep track of them and also pay attention to the thing. So Lori, did we have any specific questions in front of the panel?
We do. We have a few that I have made note of. Rukma asks, how are you able to adjust your writing style to the changing generations and the trends and perhaps even the generational ideologies that come along with them?
Wow.
Who wants to take that one?
I run into that a lot. Changing technology is something that has been is sometimes really difficult to work with, especially I think in the mystery genres. It's difficult. Although I had a fellow who had me write a screenplay for a horror movie that he wanted to make, and he wanted it in a group of people in a house that couldn't get out. And he wrote it before like cell phones were a thing, but by the time he got around to actually having it written, cell phones were a thing. And so we had to figure out how to shield the house and then long enough for the baddie to take away the phones. So, I mean, that can really trip you up. Technology can. But something that I got from one of my editors at Del Rey was mentioning, be careful when you make pop culture references, that they are references that already have legs. So, you know, mentioning something that's really hot right now in a book to try to make it trendy is also going to give it a really short shelf life, and it's going to date the book. So that's something that I'm really conscious of very strongly when I write. And right now I'm working on ghost writes of a series of like rom-coms set in the current, you know, time, but not with COVID, because it's escapist literature. And it's really, you know, difficult because the client wants those pop culture references, but you have to be very careful again, because you can't date the book. You can't have the people, you know, using language that's going to be passé. I think you can get away with having them saying something is wicked good because that's been with us forever. But it really can be problematic as you're trying to make something feel fresh and current, and yet at the same time, not give it a shelf life of 1 year.
Any of the rest of you have any comments on that, or just
Well,
write
I'll
what you write?
throw out that in terms of the changing sensibilities of you know, the new generations, or just maybe all of our sensibilities are changing. Hopefully, all of our sensibilities are actually changing. That when I wrote my first Holmes on the Range novel, you know, again, looking at it as I did at the time as a historical fiction work, that I saw it as partially a response to the Western genre, in that one thing I absolutely wanted to do was make sure that the characters were diverse, because I, you know, get sort of annoyed with a certain stripe of the Western genre, let's say Gunsmoke, super white bread, and would just lead you to believe that it was the land of Anglo-Saxons, you know, and maybe an Indian or two, and that was basically it. And so I wanted to make sure that the reality was reflected, that there were people of all sorts of different backgrounds. Now, in doing so, I also wanted to show that these people of all these other backgrounds were also often horribly mistreated with language that was not respectful. And so I included some of that in the early books. And since that time, sensibilities have shifted, and even a depiction of racism, historically accurate, is not welcomed. And so you have to think about how these things are going to be received. And I've made some mild adjustments as I've put those books back out, which I really grappled with. You know, I don't want to whitewash anything. I don't want to pretend this wasn't the reality. But are there ways that I can depict that reality without triggering people by using certain language? And I've been trying to walk that tightrope in a way that's respectful, but also true to the past. And I don't know, it's a toughie.
Yeah.
I'm 52 years old. I'm doing my best to keep up, everybody.
That's true. Lori, any other questions?
Well, Steve, this one's coming right back to you again. Anna asks, actually, she says she recently read The White Magic Five and Dime, which is quite a departure from your home series. Share how that book or series came into being, if you don't mind.
Well, thank you for the plug and for asking. And to tie it into the genre thing, it definitely, and sort of mixing genres, it definitely has that kind of origin story. But the origin is that I have a good friend, Lisa Falco, who is a school teacher in Los Angeles. But as a sideline, as a hobby, she's an extremely good tarot card reader. And she is also a writer. And she and I, this was years ago, were just sort of talking about the things we were working on and the writing projects we were thinking about. And she wanted to do a novel that would be about a tarot card reader and her relationships with her different clients and how she uses the tarot to help them with problems in their lives. And I thought that was a very interesting idea. And years go by, and she didn't end up writing that book. And I got asked by a publisher for a list of ideas, which is a very exciting day for a writer. So I threw together this list of 9 ideas that I had. And I thought, well, 10 would be better, right? I should come up with a 10th idea. And then I remembered Lisa's idea. And I thought, like, well, why can't there be dead people? Why can't folks be getting murdered? Why can't the person solving the crimes be using the tarot to help solve the crimes? And I knew of woo-woo as a thing, but I hadn't really dabbled in woo-woo myself. But I just knew that it was out there. And this would be sort of light woo-woo in that it's not quite magic, but it is tarot. So, is there a way that you could sort of walk the line of being not full on magical, but acknowledging the possibilities of, revelation of the tarot and use that to solve a crime? So I said to Lisa, like, what do you say? Would you, if I threw dead bodies in this thing, would you want to do it with me? And she was like, right on, I'm not doing it anyway. So there you go. That's how the book came about. And so it started off as, I guess it would have been more of I'm not sure what genre it would have fallen into. Women's fiction probably would have been what her book would have been, or fantasy, or but light fantasy. And then I took it right on over to mysteries and said, hey, everybody, take a look at this. And that was how those books came about.
Well, Anna has now posted a thank you in the comments section. So that was her question. She appreciates your response.
So maybe one more question, Lori, if there's one more.
Yeah, this one. So for everyone, and this this one's from Heather Haven. So are there any genres that you haven't written in that you want to, and any that you would never write?
Peggy, start there.
Well, I'm not sure that I would ever say never. There was a time I might have said I would never write romance, but now I've got this little series of romance novels knocking around in my head. And one of these days I may actually put them on paper just to get those particular characters to, shut up and be calm again. One of the things I find is that the characters sometimes bring me stories and want their stories to be told. And there's not a whole lot I can do about it except tell them, and whatever form that story takes is the form it's going to take. I'm not as well versed in science fiction as I am in some other genres, but I do have this novella sitting there that I'm planning to do something with over the next year or so to see what happens with it. The first draft, at any rate, is complete, so why not? I've dabbled in several, and I find that each one has its own reward. So I'm not going to say there's one that I would never write in, but crime fiction in general, mystery thriller, that area is where I find my natural inclination toward telling stories is, as I say, if it doesn't have a dead body in it, I'm not sure I know how to write it. Adding the somewhat fantasy element in my House of Whispers, House of Desire series was not something I had anticipated until this particular conversation I had with this particular editor and said, well, I could do that. And I find that I do believe, well, I don't believe in the fantasy quite as it exists in my books. I do believe that the bounds of reality are broader than we give them credit for. And the world of those stories is sort of the here and now. It just has this extra element added to it. But maybe just a pure high fantasy thing would be very fun to undertake. I bet Maya would agree with that.
There you go. Maya, what do you think? Well,
I would, it's funny because when I wrote the fantasy series, I had no intention of ever writing fantasy in my entire life. I was not going to do that. I was a science fiction writer, damn it. And that was what I was. And, you know, there it was. And 4 books later, I, you know, realized, okay, I also write fantasy. And I love dabbling in different genres and not even really knowing what I'm doing when I'm first dabbling. But I think what I would like to do is I wrote one, I guess it's a steampunk story. It's a Genesis story for an anthology that Bookview Cafe put out called Shadow Conspiracy, the first Shadow Conspiracy book. And I would love to write more of that. I would like to actually write some steampunk novels that are really steampunk. Alas, my agent tells me that steampunk is dead right now. So, and urban fantasy too. I love urban fantasy, but no.
what about you, Nick? Anything?
Perversely, yes, I do. Perversely, there's this subgenre of romance that is like the ethnic chauvinist romance. Greek billionaire, angry secretary,
I hate those.
Italian zillionaire, virgin bride, this kind of thing. And as a Greek American person, not a billionaire, I've got a lot of thoughts on this topic. And one day, I'm gonna get my revenge on this genre by writing something.
Nick, my romance idea that's knocking around in my head does not go in that direction at all. You'll be happy to know.
Okay. What about you, Steve? You want to write a Greek millionaire novel?
That one has not occurred to me. I'm sort of pursuing my dream genre at the moment, in that for a long, long time I've wanted to write a Western that didn't have a mystery in it, just to see how that would go. And I am enjoying it. But again, having just reached the second half, I just introduced a mystery into the story. So I guess that's what happens when you're working without an outline, is your inclinations show themselves. But I will say, even though I have patted myself on the back earlier for being open-minded to all genres, I did realize there is the one that I will not write, and none of you want me to write it. When I was hard up for money a few years ago, I was looking around for any opportunity, and there was a small, mostly digital press that at the time seemed to be doing very, very well with a particular genre. So I explored what it would be like to write for them. It is erotica. And I cannot write that. I do not want to write that. You do not want me to write it. So that one's off the table.
Was it Bigfoot erotica, dinosaur erotica, one of those types of things, or just
It
two people?
was human beings. It was all human beings. They were doing
Okay.
most
That's your problem. I mean, you know, if it had been tentacle erotica, you would have been fine.
Maybe I could have handled that one. Yeah, but just these people doing these things, page after page, how do you keep describing what they're doing? They did it. Be done. Move on.
That way. I unintentionally wrote erotica twice. A story that was published in Analog, it was a science fiction story, was picked up by Circlet Press and put right in the middle of an erotica, basically fantasy thing. And I didn't change a word. Not one word. She said, you know, you could put the sex above the sheets. And I said, A, there are no sheets, and B, no. And because, yeah, I didn't want to go there. And the same thing happened with a fantasy piece I wrote for Amazing Stories. That the same Circlet Press picked that up for, you know, best fantasy erotica. Did not change a word. Apparently people read more into my fiction than I could.
Since we're about to start NaNoWriMo, I'll tell you this little story, which is that I started doing a NaNoWriMo project a few years ago that was going to be a piece of a novel I was writing. And these two characters met, and all of a sudden they went off and they were doing all of this crazy stuff that you're not going to write about, Steve. And I wasn't going to write about it either, but they kept insisting and they kept doing more and more and more and more of it. And that's one of the times I managed to actually cross the 50,000 word finish line with NaNoWriMo. Nobody will ever see it but me, but it was an interesting exercise in maybe loosening up some writing inhibitions that I had not been aware that I had.
There you go. So we've gone from Fantastic Dicks to Peggy Lucky's erotic novel,
My hidden erotic
remain
novel.
unpublished. So,
Okay.
which I think we've sort of covered the entire spectrum of genre here. I would like to thank my panel. I would like to, we will highly recommend that you buy books by all of these lovely people on the panel. We are going to end the session now. However, any of you in the audience who would like to pop your camera and your mic on, you can just stay and chat for a few minutes. We usually have a minor chat afterwards. If you on the panel would like to stay and chat, that would be lovely too. Laurie is going to turn off the recording and turn off the live on Facebook at some point.
I'm doing that right now.